So let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us today to talk about the knowledge commons or digital commons. I just want to say a little bit about some of the context for why I think we chose to revisit this. And sort of a tentative agenda for moving forward in our discussion today. So we did have so this is the first in our second set of readings in our reading group. So that's really exciting. And commons, the topic was, we visited then and talked about that last year in August. And full disclosure, I did the readings for that. I was not able to make the call. And I did not watch the recording. I've reviewed all the wonderful notes that you made from that. And, my sense is that, we read the sort of Ostrom's main work in that discussion, and we ended up talking a lot about decentralization, it seems. And so I think there was a lot of interest in more specifically delving into, okay, Ostrom talks a lot about these environmental or resource commons, things like fisheries or forests or pastures. But we wanted to more directly engage with that as it relates to the digital realm, data, knowledge, technical infrastructures. And so that was, I think, the inspiration for this go around, to maybe set aside decentralization, which came up a lot last August as its own topic, and it will be later this year. So these readings that Brennan and I chose are, some of them just are straight up from recommendations that we had last year, especially the Ostrom and Hess. And really, I think they provide us a good structure for our discussion. So we have, so I would propose starting with the Ostrom and Hess, sort of digging into this framework that they provide us, moving on to the digital commons reading, which more directly applies that framework and moves us into some of the more nitty-gritty stuff. And then, at the time that we were developing this reading list, I happened to come upon some work around the actual sort of tragedy of the commons, like from Garrett Hardin in the late 60s. Just for a variety of reasons, it was just on my mind several months ago. And so we did a little bit of reading around actually reading that, which of course was, what Ostrom was responding to. So I think that would be I think that'll be a really interesting and fruitful discussion, actually going back to that kind of source. I think one way to just kick this off, so how do we feel about just starting then with the Ostrom and Hess and moving forward from there? Feel good about that? Yeah. So we've got a few themes that really stood out to us in this note stock. But I'd just be curious to invite reflections from you all on this reading, and one or two things that really stood out to you as super interesting, or that weren't present in this.
Rob, go ahead.
I think maybe like one of the, I was going through and there were a few like key phrases and things that jumped out at me. and one of the very short passages that I remember jumping out at me was this very strong statement about sustainability is not like a thing, it's a continual process and it's a continually changing process. And I think that like it's easy to read like Governing the Commons and a lot of other works even then, like sustainability is a little bit of a process, but not quite as much so as she's saying it there. And I thought that was a really interesting and strong statement. That was super clear. And I thought there's a lot to like pull out of that, and a lot that's based around like this particular reading focused a lot around this idea that like everything is moving much faster now. And so what does like sustainability mean in that sort of environment where the pace of change is extraordinarily high compared to other environments?
Brendan, you had a hand up. Somebody in that group did. Liz?
Yeah, Liz. It's totally you.
Oh, hey, there's Matt.
Hey, Matt. We're starting that with the Ostrom reading, and Liz is responding to her thoughts on it, which she has notes on because I can see the table she's reading.
Oh, no, just briefly, after the initial just rush of gratitude that, you know, for the economists coming in to hang out with us, like common CBPR people, it really struck me that this article was getting into the knowledge commons from, like, there were a lot of rules about how to generate like an intangible commons, and they gave those three kind of that tripartite form of like what a knowledge commons is. But I feel like where the article really went and what I got interested in is like how do you actually govern a complex system? And that's where I personally connected with this reading more, because in a CBPR environment, I run into a lot more rules on interaction than on rules to create the knowledge resource itself, if that makes sense to people. Yeah.
I really liked the reading from how it impacts me generally as a reader. I kind of looked at it as like a very clean, you know, and to Rob's point, cogent kind of toolkit or something that I would carry along with me whenever I had a discussion about a commons. I thought it really took time to define terms and operated at a theoretical level that would allow me to like carry it around every time we have conversations like this. So it's definitely a piece that I feel like I'll cite again. And I think sort of laying the groundwork for everything that goes into making commons and defining it is something that I think is particularly useful. You know, I like to define terms before we have like big, interesting discussions about them, just so we, you know, the discussions can actually be productive. And I thought this piece did an excellent job of that. So it's one of my favorite pieces we've read.
That's great. Can everyone hear us okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah.
So I would actually jump back in and say it might be helpful for us then to actually start to define what we mean, or what is meant in these readings at least, by a knowledge commons, by digital commons. You know, we have some examples. We might find that they're potentially limited. For instance, Liz, you began mentioning, you know, CBPR, common space property regimes, or I suspect something along those lines. Those kinds of environments, and I'd invite you to maybe share with everybody else, you know, an example, you know, from your own, you know, work that, you know, might be helpful for us as a kind of grist. But in general, yeah, you know, I'd be curious to hear some more about like the examples given in this piece in particular, and how they constitute a knowledge commons, perhaps in distinction to some of the commons we read about last year.
that to me.
Totally. Do you have an example of a CBPR resource that comes to mind for you?
Oh, like in the digital space? So, Winkler's written a lot about Wikipedia. We could talk about that. And then I spend more of my time in a community called Public Lab, which just makes things more complicated by not only sharing information, but working on how to produce actionable knowledge together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's all I would say.
Yeah, and I would jump in that, like, one of the things to piggyback off of lots of examples, and I think there's like a chance to dig in on some of these examples that sort of Eric and I were talking beforehand and saying like, wow, it's kind of incredible how much some of these readings seem directly applicable to some of the work that we have been undertaking around data together as part of these projects. Namely, like, oh, we can sort of talk about data rescue as a direct effort to sort of build a common pool resource. The other thing I found really interesting from the readings was this, like, Rob mentioned the pace of change already, which I think is a huge sort of point of departure for our knowledge commons. But the other one that we sort of, I don't think we've touched on yet, is just the scarcity principle, right? Like when we transition from an environmental commons or something that is based on some sort of exhaustible resource into a digital sort of one, it's interesting to see how much, like, almost all of the articles in trying to sort of distinguish a knowledge commons from commons in general, we're trying to sort of point to this abundance or near zero cost of copying as being a very important aspect of this distinction of an important characteristic of what came into the sort of knowledge commons side of this. And so what I think is really interesting there is, like, if we're using the phrase knowledge commons and it's only coming forth when we have this near zero copying, sort of there is a technological interleaving here that is like sort of, I think, fleshed out more in the Geelong piece, but is definitely sticking to the Ostrom piece for the second is, like, it's really exciting to see that all of the flexibility of the IAD framework and and the principles for analyzing the commons do translate in this or at least they seem like they do translate to a framework for analysis on the knowledge commons as well as a commons that is based around scarcity. That's my personal feeling. I'd like to see if others agree that it does translate, but it's definitely, to me, it's a really, really interesting, like, for a framework to be that flexible, for you to move something as important as whether a resource is exhaustible or not is really interesting to me. Yeah, I think I saw your hand first.
Maybe Rob. Go ahead, Rob, and I'll go after.
Okay. I don't think what I had was really that important. I guess just as like a direct response to that, I feel like that institutional analysis, I forget what the D was in the IAD, seems like a framework for analysis that's pretty broadly applicable. Like, I don't know that it necessarily even needs to have anything to do with commons. It seems like it applies really well to anything where there are, like, people utilizing things and trading things, like, with other people. And, like, so it seems like a really useful framework. I'd heard about it and seen it noted in other things before, but I'd never run through it. And a thought I had while reading it was like, oh, this would be really interesting to sort of try and frame, like, EDGI this way, or frame data together this way, or frame other, like, commons-ish situations we know about this way. And does that provide anything useful? I don't know, but, like, I don't know, just as a response, like, the thing that jumped out at me about that is that, like, I don't think that's necessarily very commons specific. And I had something else which I forgot.
Matt?
Just when you were talking about the near zero cost of copying, reading those phrases this time, that's like a thing I talk about, I don't know where, in my intro classes somewhere. And after EDGI, I feel like I believe less that the cost of copying is close to zero. it feels like it's close to zero when you download something, but the infrastructural costs are significant. And I suppose that is captured a little bit in this idea of underuse, which was especially present in that other reading. But yeah, I just wanted to say that, like, I feel like there's something a little bit misleading about talking about digital copying as being free, because it helps us to forget that all this infrastructure is being maintained and that we can't work without it and that we're utterly reliant on it. And so it kind of causes us to lose focus of a place where commons is really important that we're not thinking.
Rob?
So that reminded me of the thing I had been thinking about. So part of it I think is really interesting because I feel like there's different versions of copy that are worth talking about and that have been talked about, but all under the same term, right? Because there's copying in the sense of like you just had to copy stuff from here to there, and there is like a lot of infrastructure involved, but that is still, I think, marginally relatively cheap. And then there's copying in the sense of like, oh, I like have a copy that I can do things with now, and that like maybe I could give to somebody else or whatever. Where like copying is also like in some way sort of conflated with provision and ownership. And I feel like those are used interchangeably in a lot of places. And what you just said, Matt, made me just sort of like trick some light bulbs in my head about like, oh, those are really two different things that we often term in the same way. But then the other thought I had was the thing. I know we're like trying to stick to the first reading, but especially in the vein of copying from the DeLong reading, I didn't have a whole lot that I thought commended the DeLong reading. But one thing that I thought was super interesting was that it pointed out that in that more technical sense of copying, just the act of like doing almost anything with a digital resource runs afoul of copyright law because everything is copying, which I thought was super interesting. And it made me think of a book I read several years ago called River of Gods, which is a novel. But if you've read it or if you haven't, there's like a whole section near the beginning where one character is like a detective who hunts down these like rogue AI computer programs. And there's a whole like thing where he's talking about how like software is sort of so functionally different from like us in the world because it can't move. It can just copy itself somewhere. And so like his act of like trying to chase something down is really like both chasing and cleaning, because it sort of like copies itself in order to move somewhere else as it's like sort of running away from him, which I thought was like a really fascinating and really good like hard sci-fi conceptualization of like the difference in like dealing with data versus things that we're familiar with in the real world and how copying is so intrinsic there.
Yeah, so I definitely think it's fine to, we don't have to feel beholden to this, to the Ostrom and Hess reading. So, we want to jump in on thoughts from, especially the DeLong et al. Reading. You should definitely feel free to.
Matt. Oh no, you didn't have anything? Okay. Yeah, and I think just to build on what you were saying, Rob, there's a question there of like, is what you're referring to in the sense of the distinction of copy are we drawing distinctions between the producers and the consumers in what would be a classic sort of terming of the way DeLong sort of like positioned a marketplace style, and like I think that can kind of be like somewhat mentally infectious for us to think about those who make and those who consume versus like co-production as being like another way of thinking about it. But I think that I'm just wondering if what you were saying, Rob, could be directly connected to what some of Liz was asking about, or sort of pointing to around sort of structures for governance of the labor that is sometimes invisibilized, sometimes visibilized of work and production, and pointing directly to some of what you were saying, Matt, around the challenge of the heavy lift of making something copyable. Yeah.
And I would jump in and just add that the discussion a little long here around forking, I thought was really interesting.
repeat?
Yeah, sorry, the only mention of forking I remember was that an entire community could fork and move to another discussion channel. Yeah. I guess I don't have I mean, that's a reality I feel we all live with, you know, in our online, our mixed reality communities on a daily basis. Maybe what Rob was saying earlier about how it seems pretty far removed about what it is we're governing and more about the governance and the principles of doing the governing, that maybe is making like this set of readings really relevant for us and what we're trying to do. And there was one sentence, I wrote the whole thing down from the Ostrom reading. It just reminded me of what happened to us after data rescue, where this is on page 51. In an era of rapid change, participants will move from operational situations into collective choice situations, sometimes without self-conscious awareness that they have switched arenas. And I just feel really seen by this comment by an author who's no longer alive. So in rambling on here, I guess I want to encourage us that I think we don't have to get stuck in the trap of the 2012 article that just went from, you know, Ostrom's 8 management principles and like being super obsessed with the zero copying cost and like just trying to translate, oh my God, it's an intangible commons, what is that? Because I think another decade almost has passed. And we're all quite aware of the servers we might need to have under our control, or the fact that the knowledge we're managing is based in hardware. And so, yeah, I look forward to us becoming self-consciously aware of forming the conditions of our own self-governance as we're trying to talk about communities working on decentralized data. I think that's really what's here for us to do.
Can I, and yeah, just to add on to that one more time, I think that's one way in which I agree that I felt very seen by the Ostrom piece, but there was, but it also felt interesting how much less colorful the examples felt. Like the continual citation of institutional repositories, and Ostrom sort of pointed to it, Hess and Ostrom, I should cite the other author, we're pointing to this, like, you know, maybe they openly asked the question in the chapter, like maybe this is a dated way of thinking about things, and particularly when contending with the notion of underuse. Like maybe the underuse is a byproduct of us just thinking about repositories in ways that need some revisiting. And I think we've spent a lot of time in the revisiting side, but what I'm kind of proud of in this group is I feel like we have a lot of really colorful examples of efforts to construct a commons that all have sort of different characteristics that are worth sort of considering. As the one that like both Eric and I were like, we're not going to touch that one, was like, are social networks a commons? Like, do they have any commons-like characteristics to them? And I think that, and I think a whole lot of people will be blanket no's or blanket yeses, but I think the discussion in and of itself would be worth having. Go ahead, Rob, and then Matt is percolating, maybe not.
So like one thought I had when I was getting towards the end of some of the readings that I think falls back in here is that, especially in the sense of like asking what is a knowledge commons or a digital commons, is that like I think there's a lot more variety there than a lot of these things might have come in with as like a base assumption, in terms of like what a digital commons is or what a digital good is. In that like there are a lot of, there's like a much broader variety of like different situations and different like baseline needs that would have to be addressed in different ways for different kinds of like digital goods and digital commons is. Just to like thinking, I mean, the long piece goes through so many different things, and like my chief complaint about that piece is that there are like a lot of really good, interesting anecdotes and things it pulls out, but it like totally failed for me to paint any cohesive picture of what it was trying to do. And part of that was because there were like so many different types of like digital commons it was trying to reference that had like so many different baseline concerns. That you like some things seem transferable, but some things really didn't. And it was like, well, how do you put all these things together if like the things you're talking about are not like transferable from one to the other? So like, I think there's something there about like just the variety of different, like what it is we're trying to define is already really broad, and like the question of a commons of like data sharing, like data together is maybe sort of trying to be more specifically, is maybe a maybe good, more specific frame, but also like to recognize that it is a much more specific frame, and you can't necessarily generalize to like open source software is like a really different kind of commons actually. Or like the data together thing might share a lot more with maybe like the knowledge repositories type view. I don't know. Anyway, sorry. Just blah, blah.
Matt, did you have your hand up?
Well, I feel like Rob and I have been talking a lot. I don't know if Michelle or Kevin has something to say.
Yeah. Anyone? You? Liz has something to pipe up and say.
I don't know if it's anything. I remember there was a moment where in our decentralized data archiving project, we were wondering about how communities might define each other in terms of access to sharing data. Can I get a quick temperature check? Are we very far away from needing to do that now, or is that like still?
I think it's fine. Yeah, go for it.
Because I think it wouldn't be crazy to, you know, approach that through Ostrom's 8 and, you know, see where we get. I mean, it doesn't really talk about, well, you know, I want to share only part of my fish with other people. I mean, I don't mean being like really, really literal about it, but I mean in terms of community self-regulation and setting up structures who can exclude as well as structures for being included. It could be useful. Can we read that out loud?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Michelle, you want to elaborate on your comment here?
Yeah, but talking out loud, not fun. Anyways, fine. Hi, everyone. Also, I came late. I'm Michelle, one of the many Michelles that works at Protocol Labs. So you might see me referred to as Megahertz MHC because my name is Michelle Hertzfeld. So hi to all those that I haven't met yet. Hello. In any case, yep. So I think where my brain was going reflects a lot of what you all have already said, which is just that I don't personally get a lot of value in saying, oh, our things are commons or not a commons, but the frameworks that Ostrom introduces and other people have introduced around how local communities can manage resources that have externalities and other people well, and do that in a way that works over time. Of course, has lots of implications for what we look at on the digital side. In particular, on the more negative side, I look at it and go, one of the things that that people who study commons say are more likely to produce sustainable communities that people don't hate after a while, and make it so that people in that group have agency over their resource, are that those groups are relatively homogenous. People understand what's going on. They're able to, understand and impact how that resource is used and governed, and then have the ability to change the rules around that to meet what that community wants and needs. And it's like, oh boy, that doesn't look terribly good for what we've been doing in tech systems so far, where the people who have the specialized skill set to be able to change those rules or build a thing that works for them tend to be very separate from the folks who need to be able to do that in a different way. And I was going to say, on the other hand, I have a colleague at work who I'm encouraging her to come to this meeting. Hopefully she will. Who is looking into the effect of what perhaps distributed systems, the impact of moving towards a more distributed system that encourages smaller communities to have their own networks of information might do to that larger conversation, where if that slows the rate of information exchange, maybe that's a good thing. Communities could perhaps, create their own homogenous communities. They are talking to other of these communities as well, but that rate of exchange slows a little bit and gives people time to process and decide what could come in, should come in, doesn't get that sort of thing. Maybe it provides an extra barrier. I'm sure she would have more detail around her thoughts there. Hopefully I'll get her to join some other day. Okay, that's that. What do y'all think?
Matt, do you want to go ahead?
I mean, I think it does seem to be the case that fast is not especially sustainable, right? Think systems that change fast don't stick around for a really long time because they're changing really fast. And you can tell I'm a historian because the article I liked the best was the Susan Cox, which wasn't even assigned. It was just a link from the tweet storm. But I did find it like, I hope this doesn't count as bike sheddy. I don't know. But I found that like this, going back and looking at what the English Commons were actually, and finding that, first of all, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of commons, and the kind of assertions that Hardin makes is really just repeating something from the 1830s, which was a polemic basically in favor of enclosure, right? So it's like it's a polemic that's part of the enclosure movement. And it's the, if you look at that piece, I forget the Lord's name, it's really similar to Hardin, where you have like a kind of engine, like a machine that human interest in like accruing capital that automatically leads to the destruction of the commons unless you have enclosure of those commons. And instead, the commons turn out to have, like been pretty successful for 1,000 years because people didn't operate as self-interested machines. And so, and they didn't always work out the same way. There are different kinds of problems in different places. Sometimes those problems have bad endings and things don't go well. So it's like, not like it's a utopia, but so what? So that I've been thinking about that a lot as Rob was talking about the way that we're different from like open source software, or like data is different from software, or that dogs are different from cats, or that just that there the success or failure of a commons is dependent on these rules, the kinds of things that Ostrom is talking about. That analysis seems borne out by the fate of the English commons when looked at it in a more granular way. And I found all that stuff helpful, that whole kind of response to Hardin literature.
Yeah, I really, really agreed with what you were saying. I love that you brought in the historical side of it, because I definitely did not click that link in the Twitter thread, and so it was really nice to sort of hear that, snapshot of 1,000 years of English history. That's helpful. I feel more learned. But yeah, I wanted to just double down on the agreement on the one thing I found really interesting about reading the Twitter thread, which sort of came out and sort of, in my opinion, needed to sort of throw this sort of racism Molotov cocktail at Hardin to try and make him seem less sort of less legitimate. And to me, it was actually having read Ostrom's stuff, it's I didn't even feel like I needed to go there. It's just I feel like Ostrom's work has completely refuted what he said with a fairly simple statement of Hardin's work was written very much in the phase of when economists were econs and they thought about people as these rational beings. And I think modern thought, a lot of us are sort of accepting the notion that no, humans are not rational. The belief that we move in rational ways is not a proper articulation of the way that human beings operate, and that Ostrom, in accepting a higher degree, a more nuanced interpretation of what actors participating in a commons look like, was able to bear out information that ultimately brought economists back to the conversation, which I thought was the win in the end. And so it's just to me, it's really fun to read oh, okay, here's Hardin. Here's somebody who wrote a whole series of things that were after the popularization of this work. And to me, obviously I'm biased in this conversation given that I'm part of this group, but it feels like it sort of wholly refutes it without needing to go anywhere else. But yeah, I wanted to throw that opinion out. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Just to agree with you, Brennan, my understanding is that for people following academia, Ostrom did completely refute Hardin, which had traveled farther in the popular imagination. And there's no confusion about that. But generally in society, how many people would say the phrase tragedy of the commons versus how many people had ever heard of the first Nobel Prize winning in economics, female named Eleanor Ostrom, or her principles for commons management, which sounds
who would believe that? Right? You need that marketing hook. You had me in a minute 28.
Yeah. So I was glad for this tweet thread. I had seen it organically on Twitter and then delighted to see that it showed up in our reading list.
Super into it, yeah. What else?
Matt, you had your hand up. Oh, Michelle?
No, I had my hand up before and then I said some stuff, I think.
Okay. Michelle?
This is a question to throw out at the group. Let's see if I can pull it back out after being distracted a second ago, though. I was wondering if anyone had insight or thoughts, I'm sure you have, around the thing that I touched on earlier, the specific challenge of managing anything that has to do with our modern technology, because the technology is so complicated, and that the people who need to, or would in a system that follows, that is likely to succeed given what Ostrom and that school of thought recommends, needs to have people that are able to engage more fully, perhaps, in the discussions around it, and how that impacts then what we're trying to do, or what we broadly, what folks who hope to move to a space where normal folks, people who aren't tech folks, people who are in able to support their own knowledge space or data space, that kind of thing. I'm curious what you all think about that, or if you've talked about that already, or what do you think? I think about this a lot, but I go down a little sad hole. So maybe you all have more optimistic ideas than me.
Maybe just for, to add some rails on the thought experiment, maybe we could have a path for, a course that technologists would be willing to participate in versus a course that would be done to technologists. And I'm not sure if I have much more on the latter, but for the former, I think setting up community structures where not being an asshole is further defined as like you can't insult someone for knowing less than you. Like you're not making decisions without like reading your community in, or like any number of kind of like social structures. So, building a society where professions aren't off, chasing the edge. I don't know if that's reasonable. I don't know if that's, would ever slow down I don't think it would ever slow down all of tech development, but I think you could make a pool. I think you could make a corner of society where not only all humans respect each other as peers, but all professions respect each other as peers, which is hard to capture in codes of conduct, but people are working on it. And then other than that, I wonder, what could you do in a situation where technologists, don't opt in?
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea.
Michelle has a question from the chat. Do you all think that tech will eventually be in a place where it's not so hard, TM, where people can engage more easily?
Where people were non-technical?
Rob?
I think this question and the one you started with, Michelle, are really important. But I feel scared that I don't have like better, more optimistic answers also. Because I feel like it has to be for things to work well. Like on a big macro picture, like an example of the problem feels like the fact that we always return to, like on a legislative level, like we can't make good laws about technology because nobody understands it, but we don't create an environment where it's easily or readily understandable, and like how do we get there? Part of it, I think, actually does feed into what Liz was just saying about, it's not just community standards, but it's how we discuss and share and explain when other people who are less expert care to at least try and participate. Although that's at like the much more micro level. I think that like builds up and out. But I also I don't have great thoughts for bigger things, bigger levers to pull on in that way. And I feel like on a more micro example, just thinking about with the client I'm working with right now, yesterday we were talking through they're thinking through like changing their content management system, and their whole thing right now is predicated on like everything lives in Git, but they have this really painful workflow for the people who are like content authors who are not technical experts, and so they take the path of least resistance, which is a really bad path for everybody. And so they're looking at like changing their CMS, and one thing that would do would be like put content authors entirely outside of Git, and that's nice and easy because then the content authors don't have to understand Git or understand version control. And I sort of like pushed back a little bit and was like, well, is that really the thing you want, or do you need to figure out how to like make that situation a more understandable and participatable situation? Because like actually the concepts of version control are super valuable, and if your content authors understood that, they could work more readily with their developers when they're like building a whole new branch of a thing that needs to say, sort of like separate from what you're releasing every day until it's ready to go, or when the content needs to move with the code. And it's sort of like this really hard push to say like, oh, how do we express those ideas and manage those things in a way that like we can teach the less technical expert people to still like use the technology and get the value out of it, and have more understanding, and not just say, oh, that's too complicated, it's over here. So like, and I couldn't figure out how to remedy the situation in that discussion. So yeah, but then also I keep coming back to what Liz just said about, like even just in our technical spheres, like starting small, having better, more clear, concrete rules about the bad things that people do that aren't just sort of flame war sort of things, right? But like a knowledge deficit is not a skill deficit, and so on. And actually, I've never seen that enunciated really clearly anywhere. So I would love to like chase down that rabbit hole either now or some other time.
I'd love to we deal a lot with expert cultures in my day job. And there's a set of readings I'd love to do, a later talk. I guess we're booked through August. But, after that, breaking down readings that go from, how much culture, even gender or neurotypes are embedded in programming languages, and how it doesn't have to be like that. Or Sandra Harding's The Science Question in Feminism. And generally breaking down, how have expert cultures been gatekeeping, been exclusive, been self-selecting, homogenizing of whoever's involved in them. And we all know the hostile effects of this, but I think our technology cultures don't have to be that way. But that's something that, is going to be up to people like us to build.
Matt.
I mean, they don't have to be that way is the hopeful part, right? And kind of easy to forget. It's always hard to try to build a different kind of world because the mainstream, because the world is big, and there are huge forces that organize things in pretty predictable ways along the lines that that Liz just described. And what I feel like the thing that we ought to try to get out of these readings is, some provisional signposts towards how we might want to organize ourselves, right? Where we think about all the things that Rob was saying and others also, there are these different kinds of communities and what we're doing conditions what kind of rules we need to have, but you can engineer to some extent the success of a commons potentially.
Michelle?
This is another question for the group. Matt, what you just said, and Liz, what you were talking about, which, by the way, thumbs up to doing some readings along the lines that you suggested. So as some of you know, I work at Protocol Labs, and we're working on these protocol level changes to the way information could move. And I'm really interested in thinking about whether there are things you could build in to this, opportunity to create new ways of information movement that would help, as we like to say in user experience design, automate our best selves, make the kinder choice, the choice that supports these sorts of networks, the easier one to make. And I'm not sure yet if that's something that can be implemented or if there's any piece there at a protocol level. But Liz, what you mentioned about different ways of building things as even built into code that could be more, or at least different, that sparked something, as well as what Matt was saying. I'm not sure yet. I haven't found an inroad yet at this really low protocol level, but what do you all think?
Yeah, I just want to jump in quickly. I think one of the interesting things that we sort of if we're being a little bit self-critical about how commons form and become strong, I think the one point that I would critique would be this question of homogeny and the question of it is easier to form a commons around a group that is common or has common interests. And I wonder if building a more robust commons that doesn't engage as much in gatekeeping, whether it be a knowledge commons or otherwise, needs to sort of think about the degree of homogeny that's engaging in. And I wonder if that's a signpost we can use for goal setting. One of the most successful examples I've come across in this department is the work of the Python community, which aggressively moved to try and weed out this sort of technological superiority complex and went so far as to sort of eject certain members from the contributor community on the basis that they were not welcoming of people who were from different technical means. And I think that you could even more broadly consider how that overlapping principle, or you don't want to go all the way to the other end of the spectrum and say that we should try to connect completely disparate folks with no interest. Like that's just a recipe for frustration, I think. And so is there some happy middle ground where we're actually putting a lot of effort into the types of people that we're bringing to a table before we have a conversation? I'm really glad that Eric and I worked on this together, because I really wanted to assign the IETF DNS records white paper as a reading, because I honestly think there are some like incredible like moments in that 50 pages of pure like agony of technical reading that explain, because like if you think about the way DNS works, it's like the origin of a lot of these sort of hierarchical structures, and there's some like really interesting bits in there, but it's really dry. But I think there's something like really interesting, even worth pointing out, even amongst this group, that we have folks in this room who are excited to read DNS white papers, and folks in this room who are excited to read Ellen Ostrom. And I think that sort of overlap with degrees of commonality is, for me, is the reason that I keep coming back and keep saying like this is really special, and what we do in coming together here is really special. Because I think we have this really unique mix of unity with variety, to borrow a Giselle principle. But yeah, I don't know, others feel free to riff on that. But I think there's something in like really composing the types of people we collaborate with as a method for busting out of homogenizing.
I saw Rob's hand.
I guess I was more responding more directly to the original question Michelle had about protocols, which I thought was super interesting. I feel a little bit led because I naturally come immediately back to that speed question. You know, and somewhere we talked about Twitter earlier, and I am fond of always saying that like Twitter makes you feel like you have to have a hot take, and that's Twitter's biggest problem. Is that like if you don't respond right away, then you have failed on Twitter, and so it's impossible. It's like works against having critical thought. And I think about it's not at the protocol level, but that also makes me think about the way like Gmail won't send your email for 30 seconds so you can undo it. You know, or other sort of tools that work in that regard, which sort of like, you know, it's higher than the protocol level, but that like force you to, or like try and detect that you are like dashing something off, you know, and say like, whoa, are you sure? And that kind of thing. And where can we do more of that kind of stuff at all levels, I guess, in the technology stack? But also it's a really good point of like what I guess I just want to like re-up that question of like, what can we do even at the lowest levels where we usually don't think about that. We're so focused on like computer to computer and not on how that enables or quashes or anything human propensity for good or bad behavior.
Yeah, Michelle.
I can, another way to look at that and point to the conversation, I think there's this thread in distributed or decentralized network conversation. I think that's around like, you know, everything should be anonymous and people should be able to be in their own space, whatever it is, say versus or against or whatever, like, no, we really need to build in controls even in this distributed space so that if something, you know, someone should be able to block certain content from their own node or whatever it is. And that could be a protocol level decision. Rob, what do you think about that? Tell me more.
That made the connect back to the DeLong piece, because the thing it called out that I thought was interesting was it called out as a natural sort of counterweight to anonymity in digital spaces is reputation. In that, like, if a space requires you to have some reputation, then you can't just have anonymous throwaway accounts. And so that creates a real, like, it lets you still have some of the things you really like and value about anonymity or multiple accounts or any of that sort of thing. But forces you to still like be on good behavior and not treat those things like you can just throw them away and say, haha, I can continue to be a bad actor on under a different name. And so that's actually, and that feeds into there, right? This question of like, I don't know if reputation is the only mechanism, but in what ways does reputation fit into a system in a very like protocol lab specific way? There's so many levels at which I think that team has not actually technically gone into this territory, but talked about like how does reputation matter, and how can different actors in the system keep track of each other's reputation and know whether to pay attention to what another one is saying or not, or sort of like automatically cut them off, etc. And how do you make the cost of losing that reputation high is probably by making the need to have a reputation also very high.
Yes, reputation has been a long-standing feature of many websites where we go, where we need to be able to reliably interact with strangers. I want to point out that I'm part of a smaller experiment that focuses on empiricism, which I think is somewhat relevant because the science has brought us together in some way, shape, or form here. And in this social experiment, we're really taking care to avoid any reputation, certification, badging, or even social influence per se, just due to volume of postings or charisma. Because what we're talking about doing, we don't need to just move knowledge on trust. We actually don't need to move at the speed of trust. We need to move at the speed of, did you test it for yourself? And did it work? And so, yeah, Rob just like rolled his eyes back in the head. Yeah, it's a little crazy, but I just wanted to say that like experiments along these lines of when you're building a knowledge commons, not just choosing like here's pre-authenticated knowledge under some other system, and now we're just going to move it around, but we actually have to make new knowledge together.
Yeah, participation.
Yeah.
Moving at the speed of participation.
That's interesting because that's by definition asynchronous, which I think is really interesting to begin with.
Well, you can test asynchronously and then report back in.
No, I know. It's just really, really interesting. Rob?
I just wanted to say super quickly, like the reason I immediately went, oh, when you said that was because the first thing that jumped into my head, because I complain about this to other people all the time, is code reviews and how often I see people review something without testing it and then it doesn't actually work.
It's so true, and I'm so guilty. The number of times I've been like, thumbs up, LGTM, and like have never even read the thing. It's like, this is so bad. It's awful. But like, this is like, we get back down to the like, now we're really in DRM space, right? Like, how do I confirm that you did the thing or didn't do the thing that I really want to know at a technical level, right? Like, I want to make sure you like when I try to copy and paste from my Kindle, you know, it gets angry with me and says, no, you can't do that. and what we're talking about right now is we're trying to come up with some mechanism, maybe not. I think you're explicitly moving away from data-based intermediation of this system in your thought experiment. And I think that that's really freeing because we often end up in this headspace of like, how do I control to make sure that person actually ran the tests and actually ran and reviewed the code legitimately, and how do I design a system that quite literally entraps you into a course of action, which is like kind of a scary end, right? But is what we want as the people. Like, we want something that resembles participation, but at the same time, we're bordering into coercion in weird ways. And that's like, if we try to implement it as a technical system. But if we leave it as a non-technical thing and just skip the data, I think we have like a really interesting ingredient there, right? Because I can just ask you, hey, Liz, did you read the DeLong piece? And you'd be like, no.
I guess the key to that would just be testing. Like you just tested Liz. And yeah.
And then I failed the test.
In like technical terms, we call that a challenge question, right? And like this is like the basis of proof of work, right? It's
like we have like CI to prevent like things going too far out of hand.
And I think CI is like a great example of like we because we have CI, we want to go one layer more, right? We want to go into, did you participate in advancing the like code?
Yeah, CI is kind of like the trust layer almost. Like you can like play around more if you have CI. Because you have like a foundation.
Yeah, like a baseline agreement of we all trust that CI is good. And we can get really in the weeds until you edit the tests. Right? I commented out on the test and CI passed. And so, yeah, it's really interesting. Anyone else? I need to read out the chat right now. Rob says, this call is really just hashing the block of everybody read these 4 articles on the data together chain. Blockchain humor. We have hit a new high and low. Block height is high. Humor quality is low. Michelle.
I couldn't resist once you said proof of work.
Yeah. I almost went there, Rob, and I was like, I can't do it. I would hate myself, but you did it for me. So thank you. I don't really like it when my work comes around to, oh, actually, that is a blockchain, and that might be useful. Instead of the typical, no, you don't need a blockchain. That's not a blockchain. Yep. Super interesting, though. Has anyone heard of successful or useful either frameworks to think about or actual tests of this actually worked, ways to kindly connect real world stuff to online stuff? Yeah. I can elaborate if that doesn't make sense, but
Yeah.
how do you mean?
What do you mean by real world stuff?
Well, here's a concrete example. So you've probably seen over the years, there's been various attempts to try and do like a reputation thing, say connected to GitHub that's a little bit broader than just say code commits or something like that. It's like, oh, product management or design, that's all really important to shipping something, and we need to be able to reflect that somehow. This is a very, code-oriented example, but you could extrapolate that out and be like, oh, there are companies trying to do, I don't know, blockchain for carbon sequestration or something like that. And I'm like, well, but how do you actually prove that? These kinds of things. I don't know if anyone has thoughts or examples, or have anyone seen people do that actually well, what that looks like, or terrible examples. I'm okay with that too. Discuss. I'm interested in this connection, of course, between the real world, the physical world, and our online lives. And my brain, when we were talking earlier, went straight to maybe none of this will work till we have chips implanted in our heads, and then it's going to be a scary dystopia. Anyways, so yep, go ahead.
I don't think there is one. I don't think you can actually make a meaningful connection the same way. Like studying photography, really, to me, comes really close to this, where it's like, what is you can't take an image of the future, you can't take an image of the present. Anything that is in the digital realm is a biased interpretation of something that exists in a physical world. All right, if we think about data, it's nothing but a series of decided observations. And I think that because you can't cleave the interpreter from the interpreted, even if you throw as much machine learning at this as you want, you end up in a situation where like there isn't actually like a reliable causal connection between the physical world and the digital one. And I think you run into this every blockchain that's like, put your art on the blockchain, put your carbon on the blockchain. It's like, no, like legitimately no. And I think this is where like, DNA and biometrics like is probably an interesting conversation, and I wish Johnny Crunch was around because he could totally talk to us about this where there is a causal connection. But even then, the way that we record it and subject to interpretation of what, how do we write down the bits around fingerprints? There's a lot of nuance here.
Sorry, did somebody else have something? I guess I was just going to tack on. This reminds me a little bit of a conversation we had a couple of weeks ago, Brendan, about Starlark and Query, which is we had this whole discussion about like where trust is involved in a system, and partially how, like, especially in the blockchain space, like probably in my head, like one of the most problematic things there is that it seems so predicated around this idea of like, oh, we can solve trust. But really you've just like shifted around where trust matters. And then you've done a really poor job explaining to people that like trust now belongs here. And you have to like still pay attention there. And that's like where you have to pay attention because you have to choose what you trust. In the sense of the thing you said, Brendan, about Starlark, that I thought was a really good phrasing of it that I think I've heard elsewhere, but I can't recall really clearly, is this idea of, so for some context, in Query, there's like a tool for running scripts to like fill in data. And there's this sort of question of like, to what degree does that look like Query can prove to you that this script created this data, and it can't. That script is just, and the term Brendan uses, attestation. So it's attesting to something, but it's not proving anything. And I think that's like a really important concept in here, and especially in this space of like moving between different realms that are separate or digital and analog or whatever. Like whenever you're sort of moving between those spaces, the best you can do is attest to something. And that creates a whole, like an important seam in systems that is sort of like in one conception, I guess, like the place where we should all be paying the most attention. But I don't know that that moves what we were trying to ask any further along.
Can I tack on to that really quick? Because yeah, I think the thing I said to you there, Rob, that might make sense here is like trust comes from people, not cryptography. Was my like, that's my like anti-tragedy of the commons line. But and I think it's important to sort of use that phrasing here to point to the fact that while I don't think there is a causal connection going from digital to physical, I think coming from physical to digital is totally fine. Where you can say these people have built this thing and this is the way they choose to write down their stuff. That to me totally works. And so it's like, I know Rob in the real world and I trust that Rob is this person on the internet. And so it flows from my trust in Rob that I can trust his work. And that I think is an important, a very important cascade that is maintained in many systems and that is sort of tinkered with in others. And is worth sort of examining up close, as Rob has been pointing out.
Matt, do you want to pose your question? Elaborate.
It feels not quite fully formed. I was just thinking about this empiricism experiment that Liz described. I feel like I don't quite understand it yet. And because it like seems like it tries to run without a trust layer, that it runs counter to the way that I want to live. And here's the example that I was thinking of, which is we keep our bikes in the back shed in the backyard. There's no lock on that door. Every once in a while, a bicycle gets stolen. That is worth it to me, not because I don't love my bicycles, because I do, and not because like it's a hassle to unlock the door, but because I get to live in a world where I believe that it's okay for me to leave my bike shed unlocked. Even if I'm wrong, I still get to live in that world where, you know, and like I say, it's kind of half baked, but like there's something like I want. The commons worked because people operated not as self-interested machines, but as members of a community. I feel like if we are to build a data commons or knowledge commons, it will work because people operate as members of a community and have some interest in fulfilling a role in that community. Something like that.
That I want to live in that world. I want to be your neighbor, Matt. You know, because sometimes I kind of like regarding the. I think I should just qualify the empiricism point of view. It's this thought experiment that we're actually seeing more. It's how can more people be involved in actually generating what will then be managed under kind of a commons governance principle. So it's a little separate in that way.
Anybody who hasn't had a chance to speak, do you want to? Sasha, you had a good bit on CI.
Yeah, I just saw my name on this notes list and got really happy.
Sorry.
I made it.
Has anybody have any thoughts who hasn't had a chance to give a thought yet?
I just had a question, because we were talking about like the problems of misuse, underuse. That's the tragedy of these knowledge commons, or was it the tragedy of the anti-commons? I think that was the term that came up. And so she posed a question, and I'm gonna pose it to people now. Like, you want to live in this community, what kind of incentives do you think we could propose for these knowledge commons that people want to actually contribute to?
Matt, do you want?
We're campaigning for a repeat of the question in New York.
Oh, just that the problem with like knowledge commons is that people don't want to use it or don't want to contribute. So there has to be this incentive. You know, we want to live in this nice community. So what's the incentive that we propose or give to people that they participate in this knowledge commons in this community?
Ooh. It's fame, power, or money usually. So, which are the most, innocent applications of each of those, and trying to accommodate those. We talk about query will help make you famous or your work famous, which for data producers ought to be, some kind of incentive.
We don't have to answer now. I think that is important. Now, go ahead, Liz.
I guess I'm more on the environmental sciences side, more even so than on the environmental data side. And I think people are starting to really want to participate from a survival level. So in terms of like, is there, I personally love random groups of people. I'm like, that's like, like a challenge project for a Saturday night for me. Like, how random of a group of people can I get into a conversation? And I think it's becoming clear, like, what is the base set of either needs or hopes, needs or dreams or whatever. Someone more poetic than me can come up with this set in the human like search for meaning and survival that can unite literally any group of strangers, like in a common project. Yeah, I think we're kind of reaching that point.
So I saw Rob's hand.
I don't remember what it was I was going to say other than absurdly cheeky things in chat.
Michelle, did you have your hand up? Did you want to chime in?
I can just say to Kevin, I really appreciate that question, and it's something that I get stuck in a little corner, and so I'd be interested in just talking to all of you over time on that one, in the sense that I suppose the first bit, it's like, okay, well, there's something around personal control of data, like your own, say the Facebook thing that's come up where people are like, maybe I should not be posting all the things on Facebook, and maybe there's another way to deal with that I think could be incentivized. But then it gets back to kind of what, like Matt, you said, you're like, it's me and I don't even post. It's like it's so difficult right now to fit that into daily life and all this. And the tech is complicated. That gets back to where my brain goes earlier when we were like, yeah, will it get easier? Maybe easier is not the right thing. Maybe it's understanding what is it that gets people to do that. And of course that all comes from years working in federal government, trying to do open data stuff and supporting people to do data management, data exchange better, and trying to get folks to, submit metadata or whatever it is for their science data set, all these things. And it's just difficult. So yeah, I also appreciate, Liz, I think you come at this from a different angle, and I love hearing your perspective on this, and everybody's.
Kevin, do you want to chime back in here?
I just wanted to ask Matt, like, because you said you don't even do it. What do you think is the barriers, obstacles? Because you study this and you obviously care about it.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm a weird case. Like, I don't particularly want anybody to ever see anything that I write, so I wouldn't put it any more places than I had to. And also, I'm a particularly inconsistent person. I feel like an undisciplined and unself-consistent person. But I mean, I think everything has to be like when we had the vision of let's get everybody to put all their data on query or data together or whatever it is that we think it is at the moment, a year and a half ago. It had better be easier than what already exists. If it's the same, then it's not, then you won't do it. It's got to be easier. And it doesn't have to just get you more. It has to be easier.
So I just want to note that we are about 7 minutes from our scheduled ending point. Rob, do you want to chime in quickly? Otherwise, we do actually want to spend some time talking about what we're going to do for the next reading group, which I think actually will tie in really well with these key themes of participation and trust that have emerged. So Rob, do you want to just have one quick last comment or question?
I guess I remembered what I was going to say before is, and I will try and keep it short, which is that, so we asked what could pull people towards participating. And I think Matt said the traditional ones are fame, power. And that made me think, especially in the context of what Liz was saying, that I think fame is a big attractor, but it's not, back to this question of a sustainable participation. I think it's often not a sustainable attractor. But the flip side of fame that is a sustainable attractor is validation from close peers. And that really is this thing is super sticky. People really stay involved if they just have that. And so I think there's something there.
Awesome. So, I would say that exactly this, I think, is going to be a great starting point for our next reading, which is on civics. So, what are our responsibilities as members of a community, and responsibilities in participating in particular. So the issue is that I believe we don't have a designated facilitator or two. I think Matt had originally signed up. Dawn was maybe on the list.
I think Dawn and I have been talking about it, so I think we thought we were still in charge.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think.
And I know Dawn's on about 75 different things, so if it makes sense for her to drop, then that's fine with me.
Sure.
You can help.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just we can help.
Cool. Oh, go
Say
ahead.
one or two more words. We had a meeting 2 weeks ago where we came this close to defining our readings, and which is in issue 45 on the thing. And what I think that we sort of have is an article about civic republicanism, which is maybe it feels a little bit too imbricated, too involved in a political philosophy conversation, but on the other hand, still kind of cool and useful, because it just talks about this sort of tradition in political thinking that is in some ways always been at loggerheads with liberalism and individual rights. And I think it's useful for us to think about like where we are in this communitarian versus libertarian thing. And then that's the one, because that's the one that I mostly talked about, that I remember what the choice was. But if you look at the issue, you'll see there are a bunch of categories, sort of civic, citizen, community, digital civics, and we thought maybe we were going to end up dropping civic tech because we all kind of know what that is. Yeah, so we don't, I don't remember what readings we almost nearly became very close to deciding on, but we'll send out an email soon.
Super pumped. Thanks for coming, everybody. I think this is like a really good one.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is really good, really helpful. Does anyone want to take a stab at like putting a bow on this? Maybe not a stab, make a try. Does anyone want to try instead of puncturing with a knife? Yeah. Give it a go, Kevin.
So one of the things that I saw in the readings was that like this type of work always starts with like individuals and small groups of people, and the homogeneity that we have is this common purpose that Liz is talking about. I think beyond survival, but helping others survive or just helping the world make a better place. And I'm glad that this group of small people are working on this problem, even though we don't have all the answers, obviously. But it's nice to hear from everybody, the thoughts and stuff. This is how we have to start. So.
Very cool. I think that's a perfect closing. And I completely agree. Start small, get bigger, or maybe don't get bigger and just enjoy the small. Whatever. I don't care.
Awesome. Yeah, great.
Oh, I need to go back and read Ellen Foster's Z. Again. But cool. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I think this is great. You should all have a lovely Tuesday or whatever day it is, wherever you are in the world. Is it Wednesday where you are, Michelle? Oh, wow. That's impressive. We have somebody talking to us in the future.
Oh my God. What time zone are you in?
I'm in Melbourne, Australia at the moment.
Wow, that's like.
So it's Wednesday. Wednesday's great. It's looking all right out there. Yeah. Your Wednesday's going to be wonderful.
Leading edge of time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and we will.
Thank you. This was a great way to start it. I feel energized.
Amazing. Oh, so good. Okay, well, I think that wraps up our first reading group. Thanks so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you all.
And yeah, look forward to seeing everybody at the next one.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.